Thanks everybody for joining us today. Very happy to spend a couple of minutes with you talking a little bit about really the role of firewalls in a unified security platform and as part of a unified security strategy. And really, in light of all the things we've seen change in the security paradigm in the last 2 months, 3 years, or two years, 3 years or so. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll start out with just a high-level discussion on trends in the threat landscape, give you a couple of data points that will contextualize the rest of the discussion, hopefully. And we'll sort of talk about sort of the evolving role of the firewall in your security stack and talk about some of the key areas of focus you should pay attention to when selecting a firewall, some of the feature sets that you should be looking at, and how you would implement them to improve your security and facilitate what you need out of your firewall to run your business. We'll talk a little bit about some of the unique capabilities that WatchGuard provides, things like knowledge sharing, the idea that you can share data points across different security layers and improve your efficacy. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more detail about the unified security platform and how that strategy and that vision for WatchGuard really can benefit you as you look to build your own security within your business. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Excuse me. So the first thing I really want to talk about is just the tremendous amount of volume of attacks and cyber attacks that businesses are dealing with and really have been dealing with for the last 2 months, or excuse me, 2 years, 18 months. And so, it's been a very aggressive threat landscape. We've seen major breaches happen in the last year or so. You think about the Colonial Pipeline attack, which really wreaked havoc last year, made a lot of headlines to really kick off the year. But just generally, the volume of cyber attacks that businesses are being subjected to has escalated dramatically. Over 560,000 new pieces of malware are detected every day by the AV Test Institute. So new greenfield pieces of malware that wouldn't be blocked by a traditional signature-based protection potentially. There's also been a 400% increase year over year in phishing attacks. And this is something that the FBI themselves noted and put out an update about, warning people that phishing had quadrupled, really. And then businesses suffered 50% more cyber attack attempts per week in 2021. Right. And so all of these stats here really drive home this idea that the volume of cyber attacks has escalated dramatically. And so we have to have those protections in place to handle that volume of attacks and keep our businesses safe. And at the same time that we're seeing this escalation in cyber attacks and businesses are having to deal with this, they're also dealing with a tremendous amount of complexity within their IT environments. Indeed, according to a survey from Pulse, the average mid-market business, 62% of mid-market businesses report that their IT environments are more complex than they were 2 years ago. I don't think this is probably surprising to a lot of people on the call today. We saw in the outbreak of the pandemic, a lot of businesses really react by having to source new technology, source new security, and get the tools that they needed to maintain business continuity. Right, and so that complexity was sort of not really considered to be the major issue at the time. It was more about getting people connected, keeping them productive, keeping them able to do their jobs, and maintaining that business continuity. And so this complexity is something that really organizations are just now starting to deal with the fallout from. And the impact from a security perspective, or when you have this complexity, is essentially that the attack surface explodes. Right? You can look at this complexity in a lot of different ways, but I sort of look at it as across 3 different categories. Your environments that you're having to deal with today used to be everybody was connecting more frequently from on-premise. They're connecting to on-premise services and maybe private cloud. Now public cloud is that much more prevalent. There's much more hybridized environments even in the mid-market. We're connecting via wireless more often than not. Those environments themselves are users at their home and in the home networks and smaller offices, right? That whole environmental paradigm has changed quite a bit. From a user perspective, right? Again, users used to connect predominantly from the on-site location. some remote. Now we have a huge volume of remote employees today, but there's also different types of users like contractors, vendor representatives, public users, and the administrators that are actually managing all these tools themselves. Each one of these different users types has a different risk profile and a different risk that they could potentially pose to your organization. So having the right granular capabilities on defining risk policies around these users is also very important. And then finally, the device ecosystem, right? So, it's no longer just your desktop and laptops, tablets. Now we see IoT devices, specifically in, things like healthcare, retail, manufacturing. These type of industries have more connected devices than ever. We love our technology. We love it personally. We love it in the business arena. So this is only going to expand. We're only going to continue to see more devices, device types come within our environments. And again, the output of all of this is that we've really dramatically grown the threat surface for our business. And this has pushed it in really to the homes of users and into multi-cloud environments to a degree we've never seen before. And I say all that, of course, I started out the conversation today that we're going to talk about firewalls, right? So I suppose I have to put up a little bit of a cliche castle cartoon, right, where you have the guy saying, "Bad news, Your Majesty, it's a cyber attack." So we're talking about firewalls. It could be easy to think, okay, firewalls a bit more of a legacy solution. More remote work is happening today. The network is less important, and it could perhaps feel as if you're depending on a castle for a cyber attack, right? But I really want to drive home throughout this presentation that actually a firewall has a tremendous amount of value still today when it comes to not only blocking attacks, but also providing intelligence to other layers of your security to make them more effective, right? And the firewall is really an essential tool for your security strategy going forward, despite all the remote work use cases. So we'll talk about why that's the case. And so I mentioned complexity earlier and what a challenge that looks like and causes for IT teams specifically. But one thing I find very interesting is that the move to remote work is really the #1 driver of increased complexity. And this is according to the Enterprise Strategy Group, right? So I mentioned how environments have become more complex over the last 2 years. This really just drives home that fact that it is in fact because of remote workers and those new technologies. But beyond the technology stack, there's complexity in how users themselves are actually operating and working and having to deal with things like identifying phishing emails as an example, and IT teams themselves, how they're having to support their users who are now potentially remote and more mobile than they've ever been before. And so you see IT teams, right? They've seen around a 40% increase in support requests since the pandemic and since remote work has really become more prevalent. And they're only using security that's around $1,000 per user. So they've only invested around $1,000 per user annually in security for their users. And then when it comes to users themselves, a lot of difficulty unplugging after work, more calls, more meetings, lots of emails. They're inundated with more that they have to deal with. They're more distracted, right? And they're more susceptible to cyber attacks. And so when you look at complexity and the challenges of complexity specifically, there's really 4 areas that I think most businesses are concerned with and why they focus so much on mitigating complexity. The first is, they're having to deal with multiple point solutions, right? The average IT team supports a dozen security tools today, each with their own reporting and management console, right? That's a different system they have to learn, a different tool they have to come to understand, a language they have to get familiar with, right? There's also a tremendous cyber skills gap. You're competing with cyber capabilities out there and looking for those security skills within the workforce. They're in short supply, and so you're competing with some very large organizations, even organizations that have entire dedicated security teams. And not all businesses within the mid-market really provide security teams or have security teams. So, not having that cybersecurity skill in-house is a major challenge. And that's even made more difficult by a lack of automation, right? A lot of the systems that we're relying on require us to go through logs and use more manual processes to find vulnerabilities and to really audit what's going on within our environment. And this disconnected multiple point solution dynamic I talked about even makes this more the case, right? You can't automate across your different point solutions necessarily. And that's a significant challenge. And then finally, cost controls. I mentioned the $1,000 less per user, less than $1,000 per user spent on security. The average mid-market spends less than 2% of their revenue on cybersecurity, right? So a very minimal investment being committed to some very significant challenges and security challenges themselves. And so all of these complexity challenges are having a major negative impact on how businesses are able to secure their operations. And we've even seen, this complexity and the remote work complexity they talked about has had a very strong monetary impact on how businesses have suffered cyber attacks. And actually, according to IBM in their latest cost of a data breach report, a breach in which remote work was a factor cost an average of additional $1.07 million, excuse me. So a significant impact for remote work in the fallout of these type of attacks. And what this really drives home, I think, is that identity is that much more important than ever. And I think we probably understand this is the case if you pay attention to what's going on in the security industry and some of the big movements around things like SASE, XDR, Zero Trust. Each one of these really has user identity and identity as a key component to how they require the implementation of security. They really enforce this idea of always knowing who and what is connecting to your business network, and then limiting access to business critical systems and applications to only those devices that have the permissions to access those things. And so identity is becoming increasingly important and recognized as increasingly important. And so as we talk about network security, how we integrate user identity, how we can make user identity more useful and functional and persistent is an important part of how firewalls need to evolve as we go forward. And one of the reasons, obviously, this is the case is because, phishing attacks, credential theft, these type of attacks, essentially what they allow you to do is skip right into the environment. You don't have to hack in, you don't have to break in, you simply log in, you sign in using credentials that you've already stolen, right? So I have here a graphic of the cyber kill chain here on the left-hand side, just to drive home the idea that really using something like phishing and social engineering, business email compromise, you can really skip to the compromise and exploit part here and get within the network very quickly using these type of attacks that really circumvent a lot of sophisticated security simply by exploiting your users and your users' bad practices. But the good news here is actually a firewall is very well positioned when that user is connected to the network to actually mitigate the outputs of a potential attack following that phishing attack, right? So one of the ways it can do this is actually by blocking phishing attacks. If that person is connected already and their communication and that email, let's say, is coming through the network, we can recognize a potential connection to a known phishing location, a known malware location, and block that before it's actually provided to the user. And really prevent the phishing attack from going forward as early as possible there. But say the phish does go forward, there's also the opportunity to do things like sever command and control. Very often the phish is the first stage of an attack, and then potentially if it's a ransomware attack or another type of malware attack, a piece of malware is introduced that will then fall on an endpoint and then make a request out to a command and control server, right? So these behaviors you can identify and block those attempts to communicate out to command and control, and again, stop that attack, break the kill chain here. And then doing things like preventing lateral movement. If they get within your network, how are they able to navigate to other parts within the network? How are you applying segmentation? How are you analyzing the traffic between those points to prevent an attacker being able to pivot to other locations within your environment? And so, the network, a firewall, really is well positioned to provide a lot of security value throughout the cyber kill chain. And that's something that we need to be very cognizant of when we're building our strategy around security here. And really why this is the case is because the modern firewall, the modern UTM provides layers of defense, just really in one appliance or one instance, right? You have your basic stateful firewall capabilities, but then you add inspection layers on top of it, right? And so, at WatchGuard, we have solutions like our DNS Watch solution. That's our anti-phishing capability, looks at DNS records and requests, and blocks ones that we know to be malicious or we know to be associated with malware. And then we have our anti-malware capabilities: gateway antivirus, intelligent AV, APT blocker. These are 3 layers of anti-malware capabilities, sandboxing, AI-powered capabilities, right? And they build on top of each other to catch even more sophisticated threats. Then we have some of our basic filtering capabilities, our spam blocker, our red or web blocker capabilities, and then our ability to even do some correlation between network and endpoint with our threat detection and response solution, ThreatSync. And this is just an example of how WatchGuard approaches the firewall and adding all of those layers of defense that really act as sort of a gauntlet for your network traffic as it goes to and from your office locations or wherever it's navigating. And I mentioned some of the more advanced security services like cloud sandboxing, things like this. But all of these advanced services, these advanced layers that we've added on top of the firebox, have a significant impact in the efficacy of the platform. And then there's real value to be had here, right? So you can see that when you add in things like our intelligent AV, our APT blocker, our GAV, thousands more attacks are actually blocked when you add those sophisticated advanced detection capabilities. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case based on some of the feed data we've seen from some of these fireboxes in the next couple of slides here. So yeah, so I mentioned what we do every quarter actually here is called the Internet Security Report. It's something that our WatchGuard Threat Labs team puts out. They do a tremendous job on it, and what it does in part is looks at a feed of fireboxes, and these are opt-in firebox devices from WatchGuard customers all around the world who just have agreed to allow us to see anonymized data about what's going on their fireboxes, right? And just to give you some some data points around that, the average or a WatchGuard appliances conduct over 1 billion security scans every hour. A new WatchGuard firebox is deployed every 4 minutes, and we've protected our customers from over 22 billion different attacks last year. And so, our Internet Security Report really looks at that feed data to try and make a little bit more sense of what's actually going on and what's being seen by these firewalls. I wanted to share some of those data points with you today. And so, one of the first things that is an important functionality around the firewall is this idea of facilitating VPN and secure remote access, right? With a firewall, you're not only able to analyze traffic for threats, but you can actually improve your security and privacy and connectivity of your users by managing and providing all of those VPN connections to provide secure access to things like web applications, internal applications, Microsoft Exchange services, as well as RDP and SSH sessions to local resources. And I have Microsoft Exchange services here highlighted, but 2 quarters in a row in our Internet Security Report, we've seen attacks against Microsoft Exchange servers really escalate, and they're not just the same type of attack, right? They're different methodologies being used to attack these servers, but they're firmly in the crosshairs of cyber attackers today. And actually, I've also seen that more than 250,000 businesses just last year had their on-premises Microsoft Exchange servers attacked in 2021. So, protecting those is very important, and protecting that access to those with a firewall, with VPNs, that type of capability is an essential security step here. Now, when it comes to things like content filtering and gateway antivirus, this is when we start to add some of those analysis services so we can start to monitor what's going on in the traffic and detect really known threats at this point in time. And so, one of the big data points that we focus on is this at WatchGuard is this idea of known malware versus zero-day malware. And the simple way that we look at that is known malware is malware by which we have a signature, or we have sort of that digital fingerprint of that explicit piece of malware, right? Whereas zero-day malware, there's no signature. It's never been seen. That specific strain has never been seen on our devices or with our services and the threat intel that we pull from all of our various partners, right? And so we saw last year across all connections, or excuse me, in Q3 last year across all connections, nearly 70% of all zero-day malware, meaning really the nastiest stuff, was zero-day malware. And then only 32% was known malware, right? But that's still a significant chunk of malware considering the overall volume, right? And so some key capabilities here that you'd be focused on, identifying and blocking known spyware, viruses, Trojan worms, rogueware, blended threats. The idea that you can automatically block known malicious sites based on policy, that you have those real-time feeds to protect against things like malicious sites and botnets. All of this is really critically important to providing known defenses for your network security capability here. The chart I have here is another report from the Internet Security Report here, where we look at what are the actual pieces of malware that were regularly blocked. And so the top 10 that our gateway antivirus had a signature for and blocked. And so you can see it's a number of different types here, in fact. You had the Win32heim.d, a Win code injection. You had hack tools, IoT exploits, Office exploits, right? Phishing attacks. Pretty diverse range of different attack types being used and being blocked here by our gateway antivirus capability here. And with that, I want to start with our first polling question here, and that is, are you inspecting encrypted traffic with your firewall today? So if you take a little bit of time here and respond to that, I believe the poll should have been open for you now. That would be great. Give you a couple minutes here to respond back. Let's see. Thank you. Looks like we have only about half voted. Okay, cool. Give people a little bit longer. All right, excellent. So only 57% of you said yes, we're inspecting encrypted traffic today. So that's a very important question. I think you'll understand why I'm asking that as we go forward here. But pretty clearly, what we've seen in our Internet Security Report is that hackers are increasingly hiding their threats in encrypted traffic, right? And even going as far as to take known threats, widely known pieces of malware, and just hiding them in an encrypted channel to sneak them by a firebox, as an example. And so, we saw when malware is sent over an encrypted connection, that 47% of that malware was zero-day malware, and 53% of that malware was known malware. And that's interesting, right? So that 53%, again, could be used, it could sneak by a firewall if you're not actually going through that process of inspecting traffic, inspecting encrypted traffic, right? And so obviously this is a challenge for a firewall because it requires more processing capability. So you need to be looking for something that's able to inspect all of this traffic with all of the services that you're paying for active at a very high performance. Also, the TLS standard, right, the encrypted standard is now 1.3, right? TLS 1.3 is now the predominant standard, and not all of your firewalls in the market today can actually inspect TLS 1.3. It changed the way that this inspection process has to occur. So you really need to make sure that if you want to inspect encrypted traffic and want to into the future, that you're investing in a solution that can do that. And then things like artificial intelligence and machine learning are so important here, right? We talked about the cyber skills gap, the idea that you're going to be able to parse through some of your data and understand, oh, this is a 0-day, and how exactly to take what this action and all of that, right? Having automation, having machine learning, having capabilities that make it very intuitive for you to understand really what the threat is, the severity of the threat, and then gives a bit of prescription on how to take action thereafter is very important here. And I also wanted to talk about here the top 5 encrypted malware detections, right? Some unique things here, but one of the big ones here is the first one, and that's the XML.js loader, right? And this is a dropper. One of the things I think that's important to understand just generally about malware when we're talking about firewalls is that by and large, the malware that a firewall encounters is initial stage malware, right? It's different than what you might see on the endpoint because it's beginning the process of an attack. You know, I mentioned the phishing attack example where somebody clicks an email. In this example, they would click that email and then a dropper file would arrive. It would start to bring in more of the malicious payload for a ransomware attack, as an example. So being able to detect and block a dropper is a great sign because it shows that you're able to actually stop that attack really before the nasty payload is even delivered there. So just to give a bit of an explanation on some of the different malware types that we've seen in this report. And so this really brings us to you know, how WatchGuard really looks at the firewall, you know, at large and within our ecosystem and our security stack. And what we really believe that is that businesses today need a scalable platform for elevating the practice of modern security delivery. And this scalability is really, really important. We don't believe it can be really considered secure unless it can scale. And so with WatchGuard, what we're aiming to do is our unified security platform, really a platform that seams all of our solutions together to have a very intuitive, easy to use, and powerfully effective security platform that your team can use not only to manage their firewall, but their entire security posture. And so really 5 areas that we've built this unified security platform. First of all, it's comprehensive security. Today, we're talking about our network security, our firewall devices, but we also have endpoint multi-factor authentication solutions, Wi-Fi solutions. So having those and having them within one umbrella of clarity and control, one cloud management solution, which is our WatchGuard cloud solution. And that's what we use to manage and control policies for all of our security solutions today, including that firebox. Really on the bottom level here is where I think you get some special sauce from WatchGuard here. And the first one is shared knowledge. And I'll talk about this in more detail, but you know, we really believe the idea of sharing threat intelligence across security layers is very, very important, especially when you're dealing with advanced attacks and looking for those advanced zero-day type of attacks. And so we achieve that type of correlation with our ThreatSync solution. You know, operational alignment have to be able to integrate and function in the way that you want the solution to. So API access, out of the box integration, something that we really pride ourselves on. And again, automation, I mentioned it earlier, but automation really is an ethos for us at WatchGuard. It's something that we focus on in all of our product designs. You know, if there's manual tasks that we can eliminate, if we can make, you know, easier to make tasks repeatable with things like templating, that's absolutely what we like to do with our automation core initiative here at WatchGuard. And so when we look specifically at the firebox, some areas that I think are important to be aware of and differentiate us a little bit. First of all, high performance SSL TLS decryption. You know, we are one of the higher performing firewalls with all security services activated when we're inspecting TLS traffic. And we were one of the first to support TLS 1.3 inspection, right? We definitely believe that inspecting encrypted traffic is extremely important. I mentioned those 3 layers of zero-day protection, anti-malware capabilities. We have our APT blocker sandboxing solution. We have intelligent AV. We have gateway antivirus. We have ThreatSync, right? All of these solutions really give us a powerful posture against malware. Cloud-based DNS filtering, you know, this is our anti-phishing capabilities. We call this DNS Watch. That's something that's, again, powerful against phishing. One of the nice things about this service too is if a user does potentially click on a phishing link and that link is blocked, it doesn't just end there for them, right? The solution will actually serve up a piece of education for them, DNS Watch will, which will remind them how to better identify a phishing attack in the future. And you know, we know how important, you know, education is to anti-phishing capabilities. So that really just buttresses your existing programs, hopefully, for phishing there. Access portal, something that comes standard, allows us to provide SSO extension right from the firebox, integrates with OffPoint. I'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later. 4 mobile VPN types, including Ike V2, which is really the top standard right now. But we do have 4 types that are available to you for mobile VPN and allow you the flexibility to choose really what works best for you. And then again, our direct integration with OffPoint. And for those of you who don't know on the call, OffPoint is our multi-factor authentication solution. So having that direct integration, I think, is a very powerful story, especially if you're considering multi-factor authentication. That integration with a firewall can be very valuable in protecting your resources and providing that secure remote access capability. And if you look at the firewall and the firebox specifically, on average, every year we block 250 network attacks per box and 1,300 malicious files per box, right? And I showed that graphic earlier, which the bar chart that showed, the total security suite with all those additional services, block thousands more, right? So this is really overall all of the appliances, but still think about how many, how valuable that is. 1,300 malicious files that could be potentially attacking one of your users. What could be the impact of even one of those if it was something like ransomware, as an example, right? So this is a significant success that our customers experience with these fireboxes, and why they're so important overall for security and such a cornerstone of security. Poll number 2. How many visits to phishing domains did WatchGuard block in 2021? A, 75,000, B, 1.75 million, C, 150 million, or D, 20 million? I'll give you a couple minutes here to respond to that. And again, this is really talking about our phishing, our DNS watch capability specifically, which is a cloud-based service, again, that checks domains, domain requests with a list of known bad domain locations. So, okay, it looks like we've gotten about 50% of the respondents here. And actually the top response is 150 million. I like that our impulse is to go with the larger number, but I intentionally put the larger number in there just to trick you. It's the second to largest number, 20 million, which is still nothing to shake your fist at. A huge volume of phishing attacks blocked by WatchGuard. Again, at the gateway from even getting in and reaching that potential user. So again, a powerful story there with 20 million blocked phishing attempts. So I've mentioned a couple of times this idea of knowledge sharing. I want to share with you really what WatchGuard's approach to knowledge sharing is, and ultimately what our vision for knowledge sharing is. And this really aligns around our idea of what we call ThreatSync. ThreatSync is a cloud-based service that comes with a total security suite on the Firebox. And what this allows you to do is correlate threat data from your network, right? So all those security services that I mentioned on the firewall, you can correlate those data points with what's going on individual endpoints. And so what we use today is a host sensor that essentially sits and monitors the behavior of the endpoint, and then shoots some of that data up to the cloud service for that correlation, right? And what you'll see is that the correlation of these distinct data points actually can be strongly indicative of an attack that would be otherwise missed. I mentioned the cyber kill chain earlier, and one of the steps I talked about specifically was a command and control request, right? So let's take that example here. If you have an endpoint, a file arrives on an endpoint, and then a behavior comes from that endpoint requesting, access out to a command and control server, right? The network is going to identify that network request to go out to that command and control server and associate it with what file is initiating that potentially on the endpoint, and then it'll merge them together into a single incident, right, and score that. So really a lot of automation to take disparate data points, seemingly disparate data points, and correlate them to make it much easier for you to identify what's really a threat here. And it really works behind the scenes using a centralized AI for analyzing and scoring all of this data. It also offers the opportunity for automated enforcement, right? So if you wanted to do, as an example, if you wanted to say, hey, we think that there's an attack going on this endpoint, or this endpoint is no longer healthy, you could isolate it from having any VPN connection to the firewall until you clean that. That's such an important feature with more people working remote than ever before. The idea that we could cut a VPN connection or prevent a VPN connection and prevent a VPN being used to introduce malware into the broader network because of this correlation in threat sync. And so, on the graphic on the right-hand side here, this is a bit more of a visionary graphic, right? Where today it's the firebox data, it's the endpoint data, but as we go forward, we'll start to include more multi-factor authentication events, more Wi-Fi data, more user risk information, incident risk information. There's a lot more that we can feed into the threat sync platform to provide that value and shared knowledge across the unified security platform. Now, I mentioned OffPoint and Firebox being integrated today, but that's a critically, I think, important and differentiating aspect of the Firebox today. You can use OffPoint as an authentication server on your Firebox. You don't need a separate piece of hardware. You don't need a separate instance to stand up to provide an authentication server. And this makes it much, much easier for you to configure OffPoint for things like your mobile VPNs, or as well as our authentication portal and things like our access portal for SSO, right? There's no need for additional Radius hardware. The OffPoint gateway is only required to sync users from an LDAP database. Now, obviously OffPoint is a separate multi-factor authentication solution, but all the reasons I talked about, the importance of user and user identity and making that persistent with your firewall, this is a major step forward in that process and a major integration and making that an easier process for you to build and manage. And taking this type of approach also allows you to apply more of a risk framework around your users. If you're able to include that authentication, right? You can start to look at their network locations, apply things like time schedule, geofencing, geokinetics, these variables that look at other components of a user's behaviors, identity, right, to establish their risk profile. And then you can use that within the firewall to actually control access based on a user's risk to different resources in different locations, right? And so that's a very powerful story and capability as you're building more of that risk framework, that risk-based approach to security. And so today, I've really just talked about, at a high level, some of the capabilities that we provide in the unified security platform when it comes to the network, right? I talked about our Firebox capabilities, all the different services that we offer today, a critical component to your security stack. And then things like remote access, right? Risk-based policies, integrated VPN, third-party integrations, all of these things being very, very important for how the firewall functions and provides value in this new reality that we're sort of all dealing with today. But that really doesn't speak to the other elements of the platform that are so valuable as well. Wi-Fi, we have Wi-Fi 6 access points that can be managed from WatchGuard Cloud today. I mentioned our endpoints solution a little bit, but we have an entire endpoint security product line today, not just your basic signatures and heuristics, but extremely advanced endpoint capabilities, EDR, EPDR capabilities, threat hunting, a zero trust application service, and then patch management, again, all managed within this platform. The DNS filtering solution that I had mentioned earlier on the Firebox, we actually offer a version of that that is mobile, right? We call it DNS Watch Go, and that follows a user and their endpoint to block phishing wherever they might be. And then our user-based services, I talked about multi-factor authentication, OffPoint quite a bit, but this is a push-based, predominantly MFA solution and provides one-time password support and allows users to authenticate right from their phone, and as I mentioned, integrated with the Firebox. And so really this is just sort of an example of how this all looks together, right? This is actually a very common zero trust architecture diagram that I've mapped WatchGuard solutions to hopefully make it easier to understand really how we approach zero trust and where the value of the Firebox exists within this new paradigm. On the left-hand side, you see user risk, right? With our DNS Watch Go, with our OffPoint solution, MFA solution, we have a strong control over user risk, that multi-factor authentication capability, as well as phishing capability, prevention capability. Device risk with our endpoint product lines now, we can have tremendous control over the risk of your device, protecting of your device, endpoint health, monitoring of the device itself, detection of things like root and jailbreak, email protection, all of this to lock down your endpoint and really make sure it's secure. Again, all of this feeds into and is managed by WatchGuard Cloud, which is really our central location for organizational policy control, dissemination, and management. Then on the right-hand side, you can see the firewall capabilities. That really acts as our gateway to all of your networking, your broader network, your cloud applications, your SSO, right? That's really performing that function. And again, is managed by WatchGuard Cloud and integrates with our OffPoint solution to provide that functionality. So you can see it's a very strong stack of security solutions, all feeding into WatchGuard Cloud in this zero trust approach. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and take a few questions.
Stephen, can you see the questions?
Let's see. Trying to expand this window here a little bit. Bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, it will not let me expand the questions.
No, you want me to read them for you?
Oh, okay, there we go.
Okay.
Let's see. Does WatchGuard block until support block until verdict on APTs? Yes, we do have a block until verdict functionality, I believe, on APT blocker. But yes, there's more details in our tech resources about how that actually functions, but that is something that we support. Let's see. I didn't even know we could inspect. Thomas Bryan asked. I didn't even know we could inspect encrypted traffic. I think that's a great recognition, right? It's so incredibly important today that we inspect this traffic. So we have some explanations on, if you're using a Firebox today, how you go about setting that up on our website. I encourage you to look into that. Encrypted traffic inspection, so important. If you're not doing it today, there's a chance that you're missing a huge percentage of attacks that are potentially hitting your network. Can we protect DNS Watch client, uninstall password protection? I'm not entirely sure I understand that question. We do have a DNS Watch Go client there's a phishing protection capability. I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but that is a client-based version, I would say, of our DNS Watch solution on the Firebox. I would like to know why the adoption of SSL inspection is so low. I know we've had a lot of issues with deployment of that feature. Yeah, I think honestly that's probably just an impact of the complexity issues in part that I talked about earlier. A lot of teams simply aren't comfortable potentially standing it up, or they don't realize what that process looks like. The idea of what you might need to do with certificates to get it up and running and working effectively. And I think, you know, to be fair, it hasn't been all that easy in the past, not just on WatchGuard, but other solutions. And it's getting easier, I think, in this latest iterations, in part because it's that much more important than ever. To inspect encrypted traffic, must there be a PK environment for each configuration of clients, right? So there would be a certificate sharing process, right? And again, that's explained on our tech support page as well to facilitate that. But yes, there would be some process there of essentially standing up a PKI, and that's something that we explain, yeah. I think that's really the last question, unless there's any other questions from folks on the phone.
The other question that I'm constantly seeing is that as people ask me if we are going to share the on-demand webinar and the presentation, and the answer is yes. In the coming days, you will receive an email with both things, the video and the presentation as well. And just one more thing before we go. Well, first of all, thanks to you all, and thanks, Stephen, for this wonderful webinar. And just one thing before you go is that when we close this session, a survey is going to pop up. So please participate, because we would love to hear from you what you think about this webinar and what other recommendations you have for us. Have a wonderful day, and thanks again to you all, and thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, everybody.